The origins of the football war can be traced back to a complex set of political, social, and economic tensions that had been simmering for decades between El Salvador and Honduras. At first glance, the 1969 World Cup qualifying football match between these two Central American nations might seem like a trivial incident that escalated into conflict, but it was the tipping point for a much deeper and longer-standing dispute. The war that followed, lasting only 4 days, was not purely about football but reflected years of unresolved grievances and political instability. The roots of the tensions lay in historical issues between El Salvador and Honduras, particularly in terms of land disputes and economic inequality. El Salvador, with its rapidly growing population, was becoming increasingly overpopulated and was suffering from land scarcity. Meanwhile, Honduras, with a larger landmass and less dense population, was struggling to manage its own agricultural economy. This disparity created tension between the two nations, as thousands of Salvadorans had migrated to Honduras in search of better opportunities, often occupying land that had been historically owned by Honduran farmers. This migration was seen as a threat by many Hondurans, who feared that the influx of Salvadoran migrants would strain their resources and alter the demographic makeup of their country. By the late 1960s, political tensions were also running high. El Salvador had been under a military dictatorship for much of the 20th century, with the government relying on nationalism and populist rhetoric to maintain control. In contrast, Honduras was relatively more stable politically, but was also governed by a military regime that saw itself as the guardian of national unity and sovereignty. As these two countries, both with fragile political systems, struggled to assert their power, they found themselves at odds over a series of issues, from land ownership to labor rights. The growing instability in the region was further exacerbated by a desire to assert dominance in Central America, a region known for its instability and frequent border disputes. Amid these tensions, football, a sport that had gained significant popularity across Central America, became a point of national pride. Both El Salvador and Honduras had passionate football fans, and matches between the two countries were charged with political significance. The 1969 World Cup qualifying match, held in the midst of these simmering disputes, would become the flashpoint for conflict. On June 8, 1969, the two teams met for the first leg of their playoff series in the Honduran capital of Tegucigalpa. Tensions were already running high, and violent clashes broke out between the fans before and after the match. The game itself was filled with animosity, and when it ended in a 1-0 victory for Honduras, the Salvadoran players and supporters were furious. The violence that erupted after the game, between fans, players, and even the police, set the stage for what would follow. In the days that followed, the second leg of the match in El Salvador on June 15th only fueled the tensions further. The atmosphere was even more charged, with Salvadoran supporters eager for revenge. The game saw El Salvador winning 3-0, securing a victory that would send them to the 1970 World Cup. But the game's aftermath saw more riots and violence, and this further entrenched the hostility between the two nations. Salvadoran fans stormed the Honduran embassy in San Salvador, leading to the breaking of diplomatic ties between the two countries. The football rivalry had escalated into something much more dangerous, and what had started as a football match became a symbol of national humiliation and pride. The outbreak of violence surrounding the football matches led to a sharp increase in nationalist rhetoric in both countries. Political leaders saw the football matches as an opportunity to rally the population and shift attention away from domestic issues. In El Salvador, the government under President Arturo Armando Molina used the football violence to rally the people and shift the focus away from social unrest. In Honduras, the ruling military regime under General Oswaldo López Arellano saw the football match as an affront to national dignity and a way to consolidate power. The political elite in both countries exploited the football violence to stoke nationalism and divert attention from the growing social and economic issues at home. While football might have been the catalyst for the conflict, the war was about much more than a game. The breakdown in diplomatic relations between El Salvador and Honduras created a perfect storm of military escalation. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador launched a military offensive into Honduras, beginning what would later be known as the Football War. Despite the conflict's relatively short duration, lasting just 4 days, the roots of the war were deeply entrenched in the political, social, and economic issues that had been building for years. The war itself, though brief, became a dramatic reflection of the deep divisions within Central American society and the ways in which national identities could be manipulated and mobilized through sport and nationalism. The international community was quick to respond, urging a ceasefire and calling for diplomatic intervention. The Organization of American States, OAS, stepped in, facilitating a ceasefire agreement, which was signed on July 18, 1969. Despite the agreement, the underlying issues between El Salvador and Honduras were not addressed, and tensions remained high. The war ended as quickly as it had started, but the Football War marked a dramatic and tragic chapter in the history of Central America, one that demonstrated how easily conflict could be sparked by seemingly trivial events. Ultimately, the Football War serves as a reminder of the complex relationship between sport, nationalism, and political conflict. What began as a football match between two nations ended up revealing deep-seated divisions and unresolved disputes that could not be ignored. Though the war lasted only a few days, its legacy would shape the relationships between El Salvador and Honduras for years to come, leaving behind scars that would take much longer to heal. The Football War, despite lasting only 4 days, was a conflict marked by intense military operations and significant casualties. While the spark for the war was a football match between El Salvador and Honduras, the violence that erupted was fueled by deeper political, social, and economic tensions that had been building for years. The war was largely fought along the border between the two countries, with El Salvador launching a full-scale military invasion into Honduras. What began as a diplomatic dispute quickly escalated into a military confrontation that would involve airstrikes, ground offensives, and battles between both nations' armed forces. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador initiated the military assault after diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis failed. The Salvadoran government, led by President Arturo Armando Molina, saw the opportunity to assert its dominance and resolve the long-standing issues between the two countries. At the same time, there was a growing sense of nationalism among the Salvadoran people, and the government used the football match's aftermath to rally the population behind the military operation. The attack began with artillery shelling and airstrikes aimed at military and strategic targets within Honduras, including communication centers, airfields, and border outposts. El Salvador's forces sought to create a quick and decisive blow to force a surrender from Honduras. The Salvadoran military, although smaller in size compared to the Honduran forces, was better equipped in some areas. Their military strategy focused on speed and surprise, with ground troops crossing into Honduran territory and pushing toward key areas such as the capital city of Tegucigalpa. El Salvador's military had the support of fighter jets, which carried out bombing raids targeting Honduran airfields, further crippling Honduras' ability to respond effectively. The airstrikes were particularly significant, as they showcased the growing role of air power in modern conflicts, enabling smaller nations to inflict damage on larger adversaries from the sky. On the other hand, Honduras, though facing a surprise attack, was not without its own military strength. The Honduran army mobilized quickly in defense, drawing on both regular army forces and civilian militia groups who were eager to defend their country. While the Honduran military was less prepared for an airstrike-heavy assault, it was familiar with the difficult terrain along the border with El Salvador, which played a crucial role in slowing down the Salvadoran advance. Honduran forces fortified key positions, particularly near the border, and used the mountainous landscape to their advantage. The Honduran Air Force, despite being taken by surprise, retaliated by launching counter-air strikes against Salvadoran positions. However, the Salvadoran air superiority proved to be decisive in the early stages of the conflict, giving them the upper hand. Fighting was concentrated in the western regions of Honduras, near the border, as both sides engaged in ground combat. The Salvadoran army advanced through the rough terrain, encountering resistance from Honduran forces at various points. The Salvadoran forces attempted to capture key strategic locations, including the town of Santa Rosa de Copan, which was located just a few miles from the Salvadoran border. The battle for this town was intense, with both sides suffering casualties. While the Salvadorans made initial advances, the Hondurans managed to hold their ground with the help of reinforcements and air support. The fighting between the two nations was brutal, with both sides employing conventional military tactics, such as infantry assaults and artillery bombardments. However, the Salvadoran airstrikes had the most immediate effect, disrupting the Honduran ability to respond effectively and causing widespread damage to infrastructure. The Salvadoran forces were able to make rapid progress through the initial stages of the war, but as the conflict wore on, the lack of supplies and the rugged terrain began to slow them down. Meanwhile, Honduras began to receive international support, particularly from the United States and other Central American nations. This support, along with the fortification of Honduran positions, played a crucial role in slowing the Salvadoran advance. Despite the military action, the war remained relatively contained to the borders of both countries, and neither side engaged in large-scale operations beyond their respective territories. This limited scope of the war was in part due to the intervention of the Organization of American States, OAS, which had called for a ceasefire after just 4 days of fighting. The United States, which had interests in both countries, also exerted pressure on both sides to end the conflict and restore peace to the region. By July 18, 1969, both El Salvador and Honduras had agreed to a ceasefire, ending the war as abruptly as it had started. The 4-day conflict had claimed the lives of around 2,000 people, with many more injured. Thousands of civilians were displaced, and both countries faced significant economic and infrastructure damage. The war also left lasting scars on the two nations, with tensions continuing to simmer for years after the ceasefire. The political and social impact of the war was significant, particularly for Honduras, which bore the brunt of the conflict. While El Salvador had hoped that the military action would force Honduras into a political settlement, the result was far from what they had anticipated. In the aftermath of the war, the ceasefire agreement facilitated by the OAS did not address the core issues between the two countries, such as land disputes, migration, and economic inequality. These unresolved problems would continue to simmer beneath the surface, leading to future tensions. While both sides returned to their respective borders, the football war remained a painful reminder of how fragile peace can be and how easily conflict can escalate when underlying issues are not addressed. The limited duration of the football war might suggest that it was a short and inconsequential conflict, but the reality was far more complex. It served as a stark illustration of the ways in which national pride, political agendas, and military power can converge, leading to a rapid and devastating escalation of violence. The war was a stark reminder that conflicts, even those triggered by seemingly innocuous events like a football match, can have profound consequences that stretch far beyond the battlefield. The legacy of the football war lives on in the memories of those who lived through it and in the lessons learned about the dangers of escalating tensions without addressing the root causes. The aftermath of the football war between El Salvador and Honduras was a complex and painful period for both nations, leaving deep scars in their political, social, and economic landscapes. Despite the war's brevity, its consequences reverberated for years, and the truce that brought an end to hostilities did little to resolve the underlying issues that had led to the conflict in the first place. While both countries quickly returned to their borders after the ceasefire, the unresolved grievances, land disputes, immigration tensions, and economic inequality continued to fester and influence relations for decades. The war also underscored the role of nationalism and sports as tools for political mobilization, showing how easily public sentiment could be manipulated for political gain. One of the immediate consequences of the war was the significant loss of life and property. Thousands of civilians, mostly from Honduras, were killed or injured during the conflict. The fighting displaced thousands of families, many of whom lost their homes and livelihoods. In particular, the Salvadoran military's airstrikes and artillery bombardments caused extensive damage to infrastructure in Honduras, including schools, hospitals, and homes. The destruction of vital infrastructure not only hindered the recovery efforts, but also compounded the economic difficulties that Honduras was already facing. In El Salvador, While the destruction was not as severe, the war still had a profound effect on the nation's economy, further straining a country already struggling with issues of poverty and inequality. While the war itself was brief, its consequences on the international stage were more lasting. The Organization of American States, OAS, played a crucial role in mediating the ceasefire, but its inability to address the root causes of the conflict left both countries with unresolved issues. The OAS had managed to end the fighting, but its efforts to mediate a lasting peace were insufficient in bringing about meaningful change. The ceasefire did not address the key issues of land reform, immigration, or economic inequality, which were at the heart of the tensions between the two countries. Both El Salvador and Honduras were left to grapple with the same issues that had driven the conflict in the first place, and as a result, the tensions between the two nations remained high for many years after the war ended. For El Salvador, the war's aftermath brought about a period of political instability. President Arturo Armando Molina, who had used the war to rally nationalistic sentiment and distract from internal problems, faced increasing opposition from both the public and political rivals. Although El Salvador had technically won the war by asserting its military dominance over Honduras, the country was left with little to show for it. The government's failure to address the underlying causes of the conflict, such as the migration of Salvadorans to Honduras and the inequities in land distribution, left many people dissatisfied with the government's handling of the situation. The Salvadoran economy, already fragile, continued to struggle, and the social unrest that had been simmering beneath the surface began to escalate. In Honduras, the war left a lasting sense of humiliation. Despite the ceasefire and the return to the status quo, the country's pride had been wounded. Honduras had fought fiercely in defense of its sovereignty, but had ultimately been defeated by a smaller, less powerful neighbor. The sense of defeat was compounded by the widespread destruction that the war had caused. For many Hondurans, the war was a symbol of their country's weakness and vulnerability. This sense of national humiliation contributed to a prolonged period of political instability as various factions within the country struggled for power. The tensions between the military and civilian governments in Honduras deepened in the years following the war, with each side blaming the other for the country's inability to protect its sovereignty. Internationally, the war drew attention to the fragile nature of Central American geopolitics. Both El Salvador and Honduras were economically dependent on the United States, which had a vested interest in maintaining stability in the region during the Cold War. The war had the potential to destabilize the region, which was already suffering from political unrest and revolutionary movements. As a result, the U.S. government became actively involved in mediating the conflict and pressing both countries to cease hostilities. However, despite these efforts, the war only highlighted the underlying tensions in the region. The Cold War context further complicated the situation, as both countries found themselves caught in the larger geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, which added a layer of external pressure to an already tense situation. In the years that followed, both El Salvador and Honduras would face more significant challenges. El Salvador, in particular, would experience a period of internal turmoil that would culminate in the Salvadoran Civil War in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The issues of land reform and inequality that had been central to the football war were never fully addressed and would continue to fuel conflict within the country. The war with Honduras, though short-lived, was a precursor to the more significant internal struggles that El Salvador would face in the following decades. Honduras, too, would continue to experience political instability, which was compounded by the economic strain and the lingering sense of defeat that resulted from the war. On a broader scale, the football war left a lasting legacy in Central America, where political instability and military conflict were common. The war exposed the fragility of the region's political systems and demonstrated how easily national pride and sport could be manipulated for political purposes. The manipulation of football rivalries for political gain was not unique to El Salvador and Honduras, but was a strategy used in other parts of the world as well. The football war serves as a stark reminder of how sports can be intertwined with national identity and political power, and how easily passions can be inflamed in times of social and political crisis. Ultimately, while the war ended in a ceasefire, the issues that led to the conflict were far from resolved. The legacy of the football war is one of missed opportunities and unresolved tensions. The brief, intense conflict left both countries with deep scars that would take years, if not decades, to heal. The war also highlighted the fragility of peace in a region that had long been marked by instability and the ease with which seemingly small events could spiral into larger conflicts. The football war remains an important chapter in the history of Central America, a reminder of the dangers of unaddressed grievances and the destructive power of nationalism and sport.